Betty over to Washington next. Malcom Glenn, absolutely amazing speaker. Really pleased to have you. First time at Legal Geek, talking about the future of cities. Over to you, Malcom.
My name is Malcom Glenn, and I've spent much of the past decade working to make influential institutions contribute to the health and wealth of cities. I spent years working on communicating Google's strategy around a whole host of efforts, including our real estate footprint in Northern California and our other major office locations around the world. I then spent about 4.5 years at Uber, where I led the company's work to make the platform more accessible for people from underserved communities. And just before the start of the pandemic, I left Uber to focus on housing and workforce issues. What that means practically is that I'm currently a fellow for New America, a public policy think tank based in Washington, D.C. I'm specifically working on their Future of Property Rights program, where I examine issues related to housing instability around the world. I'm also a senior fellow for the Center for Workforce Inclusion, which is a nonprofit that's focused on creating equitable future of work opportunities for older adults. And I'm also the director of public affairs at Better.com, which is one of the leading digital platforms for home ownership in the United States. And finally, I serve as a member of the Council on Criminal Justice, which is a bipartisan effort to come up with common sense, evidence-based solutions to reforming the broken American criminal justice system. When I was invited to join the Legal Geek conference months ago, it was during what feels like a completely different world. I was originally going to join you all in person in New York, and then also in person in London. But of course now, instead, I join you from my home in Washington, D.C., meeting you all wherever you are, all around the world. And we, of course, have all felt just how much the world has changed over the last many months. And so many of those changes have felt deeply personal. Things like the inability to see our friends and our family, the prospect of losing work or facing economic uncertainty of some kind, or for too many of us, having to deal with the prospect of a friend or a loved one who has contracted COVID-19. But the impact on the world goes far beyond the creation of a new cottage industry of masks and hand sanitizer. Entire ecosystems have been fundamentally forced to readjust in order to meet a moment that has been defined by the coronavirus. My work to this point has been focused on making the very best of those ecosystems. And by ecosystems, I mean, of course, cities. At Google, I spent time making sure our commercial real estate footprint was thoughtfully taking into account the concerns of local residents. At Uber, I was committed to transportation equity and helping people more easily connect to the places they need in order to prosper. And now I think about how we can make housing, an area that's been rife with government and private sector sanctioned discrimination to keep certain communities, particularly Black people, from being able to afford buying a home. I work to make housing more accessible so that more people in the United States can build the intergenerational wealth that unlocks countless opportunities. But all of those areas have changed as our world has changed. Take commercial real estate. It's not a question of whether and when and to what degree people will or will not return to their offices for work, and what that means for their landlords, the skyscrapers. But the impact is actually much larger. There are thousands of restaurants and small businesses based in downtown city centers that rely on commuters coming into work in order to survive. And they've seen their businesses basically fall off a cliff during COVID. Many have had to shut down entirely, and the ones that haven't are simply hoping that they're able to stay afloat as the pandemic rages on. When it comes to transportation, the most affordable and environmentally sustainable way to move large numbers of people is and will continue to be via public transport. But of course, in the midst of a pandemic, people are, needless to say, uncomfortable with the notion of sharing the air in a densely packed space with a bunch of strangers for an extended period of time. And on the subject of residential housing, many people, like me, like many of you, who are fortunate enough to have jobs that allow us to work from home, if we're fortunate enough to be thoughtful and have the resources to be thoughtful, have considered what type of space we have that can best support our months and months and months of working from home. What that means practically is that we're starting to see trends of people moving away from cities in the United States like San Francisco and New York, which just so happen to be the two most expensive housing markets in all of America. Now listen, all of the responses in the short term can make you think that cities just simply aren't going to survive. But it is my belief that the death of cities narrative has been written countless times before, and it's been proven wrong each of those times. This time, while challenging, is no different. The death certificate for cities was written in 1919 during the flu pandemic. It was written during previous economic downturns, both after the Great Depression and again in the United States during the 2008 housing crisis. It was written for New York City after 9/11. And like all of those times, I think post-COVID, cities will bounce back. Because the existential question before us is, how many of the things that we've seen in response to COVID are temporary, an immediate reaction to people navigating the uncertainty of this time, and how many of them are going to be permanent? Listen, some things will absolutely change. We probably won't go to an office for 5 days of a week as the default, and we will absolutely have more flexibility to work from where we need to be as long as we're accomplishing the tasks at hand. And that's probably something that should have been the case prior to COVID, and something that we're seeing as a result of the pandemic, that productivity can happen anywhere and that we have the technology to make it so. That's a good thing. But what I also know is that the human spirit prizes in-person engagement. Offices will continue to exist for bringing people together to engage in a way that's lost on a computer screen. The pandemic will not last forever, and as community spread of the coronavirus declines and therapeutics and vaccines become more widespread, we'll go back to public transportation. Every resulting decline in public transport over history has ultimately seen a rebound that has brought the services back to new heights. And with the looming challenges of climate change everywhere on the planet, it will be imperative that we don't abandon efforts to reduce our emissions impact. And for many people around the world, it is really important to remember, public transport is not just an option, but it is the only option, the only affordable way for them to get from point A to point B. And this is notwithstanding the social benefits of cities, the fact that you have access to arts and culture, other people with more diverse perspectives of thought and background and experience. All of these people sharing resources is a fundamental human instinct, and one that I believe we will continue to rely on even more as populations increase, space becomes more scarce, and we yearn for the life that we had and loved before the pandemic. And so while it may feel daunting today to imagine a city-centric future, I continue to believe deeply in the future of cities. And it will be up to all of us to fight for that future, one that will help our communities and our planet prosper for as many generations to come as possible. And so from housing to transportation to the future of work, cities give us the best option to maximize the gains for the most number of people. And so I'm so thankful for the opportunity to engage with all of you, a group of people who are thinking about these and so many other important issues. You can learn more about this work and me personally at www.malcomglenn.com. And if you ever want to work together, please reach out. I look forward to hearing from you, and thank you so much for all of the work that all of you do.